All right. My name is Gregory Gill. My topic was powertrain actuators, and I decided to focus on two specific actuators. One is a turbocharged alternator, and the other is continuously variable transmissions. This is the outline. I got a lot of things to talk about. Basic engine operation, how turbochargers get their power, transient engine operating efficiency, which will lead into how CVT transmissions increase the efficiency of a powertrain, and I'll have some conclusions at the end of that. Some real basic engine operation. I don't know how many of you are powertrain background, but the engine draws in cold air and fuel through the intake. It then compresses the fuel-air mixture, and then it ignites it, which creates an expansion, drives the piston down, and it rotates the crankshaft, which is where you get your power from. Once combustion completes, the exhaust valve opens and the piston forces the exhaust gas out the engine. Engine efficiency is limited by the expansion ratio. You start with combusting fuel and air and a piston at top dead center. As it's driving down, you're converting that thermal energy into mechanical energy, and the larger your expansion ratio, the more energy you can extract from the combusting fuel. For example, 10-to-1 compression ratio, which is actually a little bit high for a standard production vehicle, would only have an efficiency limit of 40%. That's the most energy, theoretical energy, that you could draw out of that fuel air when you're combusting the fuel, and that's actually more like 17%. Excuse me? VC is the volume, right there, the volume of the cylinder when compressed. There's still a little bit of airspace in there. And then VH is the volume of the cylinder when it's at bottom dead center. And when you do this whole thing right here comes up to your expansion ratio of the engine. And X is just the air constant. It's 1.4, generally agreed upon to be 1.4. So where does 60% of the power go? As an example, we have a 4-liter Chrysler engine operating on a dyno. Theoretically, it's operating at 100% volumetric efficiency. If it doesn't have a turbocharger, that probably doesn't happen. Operating at a 14-to-1 air-fuel ratio. The intake air temperature is 25 degrees Celsius. The exhaust temperature is measured at 600 degrees Celsius. And just a quick calculation, how much energy does it take to heat 4 liters of air 600 degrees? And we're just saying that air has its constant specific heat of 740 joules per kilogram Kelvin, which is not exact science, but we can do some basic math. So you start with 4 liters of air, which you convert to liters, and then you convert to kilograms, and you end up, so 4 liters of air weighs 0.0027 kilograms. You multiply that by the 600 degrees Kelvin that the air is increased, and multiply it by the constant. It takes 1,200 joules to heat 4 liters of air 600 degrees Celsius. Then, if you know how much air you have, you can calculate how much fuel is put in there. And fuel, you start with 0.027 kilograms of air. You have a 14-to-1 fuel-air ratio, or air-fuel ratio. You're combusting this amount of fuel, pretty small amount per cycle. You know the energy constant of the fuel, which is generally around 42 to 44 megajoules per kilogram, and then you can calculate that you input 8,100 joules of energy into the combustion chamber. So that means that 15% of your energy is going right out the exhaust. The exhaust temperature could be higher under load, and it would be higher still if we didn't lose energy out the cylinder walls as the engine was spinning. So what a turbocharger does is it recovers the heat energy lost from the exhaust gas, and it also tries to recover some of the inertia of the exhaust gas as it leaves the engine. And what it does is it spins a small turbine which is mechanically connected to a compressor. This would be the turbine, this is the exhaust side, this is the compressor which is on the intake side. And now you can compress the air and actually force it back into the intake. And one of the benefits is that it's forced induction. You actually physically force the piston down, but the amount of energy recovered from that is trivial. And you also get what's called displacement on demand. A normally aspirated engine would be limited to 100% volumetric efficiency. So if you have a 4-liter engine, you can only move 4 liters of air per cycle. But if you compress the air above 14 psi and actually hit 28 psi, you can now make a 4-liter engine an 8-liter engine. There's some limitation to that, but that's just the general theory behind it. Some of the problems with a turbocharger is what's called turbo lag. You're moving a large volume of air, and when the operator steps on the throttle, it actually takes a certain amount of time for the turbocharger to start spinning and then create boost. And then another problem is when the operator steps off the throttle, the turbocharger has a large amount of inertia. All of that air wants to rush into the engine. It can create an overpressure, and it can actually damage the engine. So one of the things that has been kind of popping around the internet, I haven't seen one of these actually in production yet, and I've heard rumors that they are being made, is actually attach a type of alternator to a turbocharger. And what you could do is you can draw electrical power from the exhaust energy. You reduce wasted energy from driving the alternator with V-belts, which are generally not very efficient. You could also, when the operator steps on the throttle, you could send the voltage into the alternator and actually spool up the turbocharger electronically. And when the operator steps off the throttle, you can draw power from the alternator and actually slow down the turbocharger electronically. And then you can actually control turbo lag. Some of the problems with this design is you have high turbo speed, which turbos generally operate between 20,000 and 120,000 RPM, which is a high frequency, which could create a lot of electrical noise if you have some type of alternator connected to that. Also, if the alternator components are close to the turbine, it's very hot right there, generally in the neighborhood of 2,000 degrees Celsius, 1,500 degrees Celsius. So all your components will either have to be isolated from that or moved away from it. And then also, turbochargers generally they take away engine power at low speeds. You'll have a less net output of engine power at low speed, and you wouldn't be able to power an alternator at low engine speed because you wouldn't have the exhaust pressure forcing the turbocharger to spin. But it's just an idea. Now I'd like to go on to my second topic, which is a little bit larger, and that's continuously variable transmission. But first I'd like to talk about transient engine efficiency. Engines is a system of a bunch of subsystems. You have the valve train, you have the oil pump, you have the intake, if you have a supercharger or a turbocharger, all of these things take away and give power to the engine at different times and different speeds and under different loads. Each subsystem has its own best efficiency operating point, and therefore the engine as a whole has its own best efficiency operating point. This is a brake-specific fuel consumption map for a typical engine. What it shows is the amount of engine power put out by the engine versus how much fuel is being consumed at the engine. The lower the brake-specific fuel consumption number, the better the efficiency. Right there, it's about 250 grams of fuel consumed per kilowatt hour produced by the engine. Down here, you're consuming twice as much fuel